STOA is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
To the STOA. I am Peter Lindbergh, the steward of the STOA. The STOA is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the nice edge of this moment. And today we have a very special guest, Tasshin Fogleman. Tasshin is one of the monastics at the Monastic Academy. And we've had other guests from the Monastic Academy. We had Yasna, who's in the room right now. Her Dharma name is Tasshin. By the way, we have Daniel Thorson and then Soryu himself. That all came on the STOA. And Tasshin also writes an excellent blog on meditation, monasteries, productivity, strategy, and more. And today's talk is about one of the blog posts that he had called The Art of Alliances. So that being said, Tasshin is going to share his thoughts, going to do a PowerPoint presentation, and then we'll do either Q&A or some kind of activity. If it's a Q&A format, Tasshin, how it usually works is people write their questions in the chat box and then I call on them, but we can mix it up if you so choose. So that being said, I will allow everyone to unmute themselves, and if you can keep yourself on mute, and then I'll tag you in. Tasshin.
Great. Nice to see everybody. Having difficulty hearing me? Can people hear me okay? Okay, great. Looks like one person can't, but most people can. So before I get started, if you wouldn't mind, could you just pop in the chat if you feel so called? It's not required, but could you just pop like why you came or what you're hoping to get out of this or what interested you about the description or anything like that? Don't have to, but would love to just hear from a few people in the chat, kind of what brought you here. Awesome. Some great descriptions here. So people came for a lot of different reasons. People are interested in alliances, relationships, curious about how alliances relate to wisdom, competition. Other people not sure what's going on, but just curious. So good to get a feel for where everyone's at. So let me turn this on 1 second. Everyone see this okay? Great. Okay. Okay, great. Oh, now you can't see it. 1 second. Sorry, I'm not sure how to. Here, I'll just hide that. That'll have to be good for now. I'm having difficulty doing the full screen, but can everyone see that okay? Okay, great. So this talk is based off of a blog post that I wrote last year. I'm assuming that some of you will have read it and some of you won't. So I'll be covering some of the same ideas, but hopefully giving it a little bit of an update and a spin for everyone here. Just a little bit about myself. I'm Tasshin, as Peter said, and I'm currently at our monastery in the Bay Area. We have 3 locations now. We started in Vermont, and we have a location in the Bay Area in Berkeley, where I'm at, and Tasshin and Cullen are at Willow in Toronto, in the Toronto area. So a lot of the work that I'm doing with alliances is based off what we're doing at Maple, at the Monastic Academy. I'm trying to help our monasteries to flourish and grow And we have this kind of broad world-saving project that needs to grow from 1 to 2 to 3 to ultimately we hope to have 500 monasteries. There's this big, ambitious, world-saving project, and I'm imagining that people here also have some kind of ambition, or they want to save the world in some capacity. They have something to offer that they want to offer to the world and see realized. And so a lot of what I'm talking about with alliances can be sort of seen from the light of this perspective, that we want to save the world, or we have something that we need to realize, some goal, some project that we want to bring about. A lot of this might be seen as sort of, there's sort of an overlap with what you might call like traditional networking advice or something like that. But for me, this is really coming from a perspective of, I want to help save the world. I want to realize a better world for ourselves, for all humans, and even for all life on Earth. And so a lot of these things will make sense if you're in that context. And then, you know, I've heard from some people sometimes like, oh, this seems kind of creepy or weird, the way that you're looking at this. And I think it doesn't make so much sense if you don't have these ambitions, or you don't want to save the world, you're not aiming in that direction. If you just kind of want to run your own company or something like that, maybe it won't make as much sense. But if you have these big ambitions, or you really want to have a benefit on the world, then a lot of the strategies that I'll be talking about today will kind of make more sense. At the monastery, we talk about this in terms of trustworthy leaders. And I have a separate post about this that you can read, but we say that a trustworthy leader is someone who has these 3 skills of wisdom, love, and power, and that those are mutually reinforcing. So the wisdom comes from the meditation component, from contemplative practice. The love comes from seeing others' perspectives, caring about others, benefiting them. And the power is what we're talking about today in terms of strategy. How do you really have an impact? How do you really help people? What do you actually do to make that happen? So if you have these ambitions, if you're sort of seeking power, to put it bluntly, then alliances are going to make sense. If you have love and you see clearly that other people are suffering and there are real problems in the world, then this is going to make sense. If you have wisdom, if you see reality clearly, you'll see that power has enormous effect in the world, and that it's worth acquiring power. So from these angles, it makes sense to cultivate power. It makes sense to have strategy. It makes sense to cultivate alliances. If you're not coming from that angle, it may not be so helpful. A lot of my thinking about these topics comes from studying the work of Samo Borja, who's a friend of mine, and I'm pretty sure he participates in the Stoa regularly. Is that right, Peter? Yeah. So this is a quote that from his work, Great Founder Theory, that really captivated me for a few reasons. It says, power can be used to accomplish a very broad range of goals. As such, many kinds of actors will aim to acquire power in the pursuit of their goals. The more effective they are, and the better their understanding of reality is, the likelier they are to seek power. This is a very fascinating claim. He says, the more you understand reality, the more you're going to want power. And we at the monastery are seeking to cultivate this direct understanding of reality. That's what you could define wisdom as. Do you clearly see what's actually happening, away from human perspectives, away from traditional stories about looking at things? Can you see things clearly, directly? Do you understand reality? And if you understand that reality, then naturally you'll want power. And so that sort of leads to this wisdom to power arrow. Samo himself, not coming from a contemplative background, stumbled on this. He says, if you understand reality, you're going to want power. So if that's you, if you are seeking power, if you have these ambitions, if you have the compassion to kind of save the world, then that's why alliances might be helpful, and I hope that they'll benefit you in moving forward with these different projects. As far as I can tell, I don't really understand everything in the world. I'm not omniscient, but there are real problems that we're facing. There are clear crises that we're facing collectively as a species and on the planet. And my goal, bluntly speaking, is to save the world. That's what I'm trying to do. It's sort of not kosher in some circles to say that. It's like, oh, are you naive or silly or something? But as far as I can tell, the world needs saving. And so that's why it makes sense to have these different world saving projects like the monastery, like things that other people are doing. None of these are sufficient. We're going to need a lot of different perspectives and angles and skills and practices. But I think that these different things are necessary and are what's needed to actually save the world. And a big part of that is that you can't really save the world by yourself. I would have done it already if I could. You would have probably done it already if you could. No one single-handedly can save the world alone. It's actually something that needs to be done together. And that's where alliances start to make sense. In an alliance, you work closely with 1, 2, 3 other people or organizations, many people even, many organizations, but you kind of have a clear sense of who you're working with, what the different skills and strengths and weaknesses are of people, and you try to go in that direction. You're trying to realize something bigger and better than you could realize on your own. It's another quote from Samo. In general, he's interested in competitive things like money or power or politics, things like this. And he says, interestingly, that the best way to win at adversarial encounters is to focus energy on building out cooperative relationships. So even in the context of adversarial competitive domains, the best strategy is to cooperate, build out cooperative relationships. In the long run, acquiring power and empowering others are mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive. So if you get power and you share it with others, that's going to bring you more power in the future than if you had just kept that power for yourself. This is also a very different way of looking at things than you may have been used to. People often think of power as sort of zero sum. I'm going to get power and you don't have it. They have power and I don't. But this is a way of looking at power that we want to cooperate. We want the most people to have the most power for the most good. So in that context, he starts talking about alliances. He makes a distinction between a narrow and a broad alliance. So most alliances are narrow. He says 2 players can cooperate in one domain while battling in a different domain. I call this a narrow alliance. So an example of this might be, say a politician walks into a convenience store. Temporarily, they have an alliance, the cashier, the store owners, and the politician. They all want the politician to purchase like peanuts or something, get some kind of snack at the grocery store or the convenience store. But as soon as that transaction is done, their relationship is over. They may have totally different politics. They may want to see a different world realized. They may even hate each other, but they all want the politician to purchase a snack at the convenience store. This is sort of an extreme example, but a lot of things are like this. If you have a relationship with a coworker, for example, that might very well be a narrow alliance where you work together in the context of the work that you're working on together. But then at the end of the day, you two aren't necessarily friends or aren't very close. You don't have these long-term existing relationships that you cooperate no matter what in whatever context you're in. And that's what a broad alliance is. It says when 2 players are coordinating to achieve most of their goals and no longer contest one another, I call it a broad alliance. So a good example of this would be Tasshin and I. We're on the same team. She's at Willow, I'm here at Oak, sometimes I'm at Maple. There are different contexts that we work together, but we're always on each other's team. We're trying to help each other in different ways. There's a lot of different ways that we help each other. We're always trying to stay apprised of what each other are doing, and we work well together and are trying to realize something bigger and better than just what we would do alone. He also says something very interesting to me here. He says that narrow alliances are the default between most players in an empire. That's Samo's technical vocabulary. But he says broad alliances are unusual. And for me, this was just, reading that sentence was revelatory, because I realized that in the monastery, in the monastic setting, broad alliances are actually normal. It's normal to have a broad alliance with someone. All the time your roles are changing. People come and go from the monastery. Even when they're in the monastery, they're changing locations or roles. All of the time the circumstances are changing. And yet you have these continued relationships where you're really trying to support each other, you trust each other, you see that the other person is a good person trying to bring about good things in the world, and you want to help them no matter what. So, you know, again, Tasshin and I have been in many different kinds of contexts and relationships with each other, but we're always trying to help each other. And that's actually normal. I could talk about anyone in the monastic training that I've done, and the default would be for me that I have a broad alliance. But in most domains, in most settings, narrow alliances are the norm, where you just have these like short-term or sort of narrow focused alliances. And what we're talking about here is broad alliances. We want to cultivate, notice, build, deepen, strengthen these broad alliances. That's what we're talking about today. So there's a few different ways to look at power, and the basic distinction that I would say is worth looking at is the distinction between networks and hierarchies. In social science, this is sort of the equivalent of particle and wave distinction. A lot of times people make these into kind of a binary where like, oh, I don't like hierarchical power, I want these like networks or like anarchical power, things like this. But at least as far as I can tell, most social structures are a mixture of both. You can describe power and social structures either in a networked view or a hierarchies view, just in the same way that subatomic particles can be seen as particles or waves, and then the way that you look at them changes, you come to different results based on that. So it's worth looking at alliances both from the perspective of networks and from the perspective of hierarchies. I'll start with networks because I think it's a little bit easier to understand the applications here. So this is a diagram that I made with an ally of mine, very close ally, and we basically made a map of our different networks. You know, I don't have the names in here, but I'm the dot at the bottom and he's the dot at the top. And we sort of mapped out the different people that we're connected to, that we have alliances with, and what they're, who they are and how they're connected. So the big gray dots are different organizations. And then the little gray dots are different people that we knew. And then again, the black dots are my ally and me. So in some cases, he and I had mutual connections where we were both connected to particular people. But in some cases, he was connected to people that I wasn't, and I was connected to people that he wasn't connected to. And so then the question became, what is going on here? Are there any connections that would be worth making that aren't currently connected? You know, maybe this person on the far right would really benefit from knowing this person on the far bottom left. They're both working on similar things, or they have something that they could support each other in. And you can look at it in this networked view where rather than you know, seeing things in terms of specific organizations, you can see lots of different nodes and the connections between the nodes and see if there's anything that's kind of inviting itself to arise. Is there anything that could emerge from what's present here that's greater than what's already present? From this perspective, I think about it in terms of serving the network. So of course, I care about the monastery and our local goals. I care about the network that I'm in of multiple monasteries, seeing that succeed, seeing that flourish. I have those aims, but I also care about the overall network. I also care about other people, even if they're not in the project that I'm in. I want to see them benefited. So sometimes there are non-obvious connections that are just waiting to happen that I can help happen. And typically, of course, you want to make sure that both people are interested in this connection. You want to get sort of what's known as a double opt-in introduction. You talk to one person and say, hey, there's this other person, they're like this, would you like to meet them? And then you talk to the other person, hey, there's this person, would you like to meet them? And if they're both interested in meeting each other, then you make the introduction. But in any case, that kind of introduction can really help someone. Say one person needs this really obscure like programming skill, and then someone else has that and is looking for a job, then that can, you can connect them together and something will happen that wasn't predicted. It doesn't necessarily directly benefit you, but the network as a whole is stronger. Everyone is benefited when there are these stronger connections. So that's the networked view of power. The other one is hierarchies. And most people have this kind of a view of a hierarchy where there's like a CEO, a vice president, and multiple teams of like individual contributors, for example. In other words, an org chart, an organization chart. That's a really valid way to look at hierarchies. Those are relevant to know the official org chart of an organization, but it's sort of a limited view. Often in social structures and power, the way that things are explicitly presented is not the full reality. There's sort of implicit information there that may not be explicit or made verbal, is like shared verbal knowledge between people. There are sort of these different connections that people have that might be like back channels or like secret alliances, or maybe two people like secretly hate each other or things like this. So this is a drawing from Tom Critchlow, who recently wrote a great post about navigating power. And he's got this like much more realistic map. And the details don't matter so much as like, actually there's a lot more people and there's these secret, hidden relationships. And he's sort of working, he's coming from the context of being an outside consultant hired to work with a company. And so he's trying to make his own internal personal map of what's going on in the organization. So even though they've got their official org chart, he's trying to work out who really has power, who's secretly, sidelined here, even though they still have officially recognized power, they're not actually in power, things like this. This happens all the time. And so it's useful to know that the explicit org chart of an organization is not necessarily the real power structure, at least in terms of, whatever goals you may have. This is true for organizations that you're in, but also working with other organizations. So I think about these hierarchies for my own organization. We have multiple locations, and so each of those has a hierarchy, and then there's a hierarchy of the overall organizations. And I've got basically a power map in my head of how those are related. But then I also make these maps in my head for other organizations that I'm working with. Say, Peter invites me to the STOA. That's like a separate organization that I'm not part of, but he wants me to be part of it. That's the kind of thing where it might be useful for me to make a map either in my head or explicitly of what the power structures are there. And so that's the context that I invented Burja Mapping in. This is kind of combining Samo's empire theory with Simon Wardley's Wardley mapping, basically making a visual representation of hierarchies. And that's something you can read more about after this talk. But the idea is that there are these different power classes, high, mid, low, and then also out. So in the example of the STOA, I would be out with respect to the STOA because I'm not in the organization officially, but I'm still connected to it. And then there's live and dead players, people who they're not literally alive or dead, but this is what I call vitality. So some people are just following an existing script, and some people are doing things that are novel and in a totally new way, and that's live or dead. So in this case, the engineer who technically has low power is a live player who's doing things in a new way that hasn't been done before, whereas the CEO and the HR department are doing the normal day-to-day things that they've always done for the last decade, even though the engineer is doing something totally new. And that's actually a form of power in itself. Even if you're low in the official hierarchy, you can have a lot of power in terms of the skills that you have or how you're doing things. And then there's actually a third axis here. You can see different colors. So the green is like who you are allied with, who you're working with, who you have a good relationship with. Yellow is someone that's neutral. And then the red is like an enemy. They may not be trying to kill you, but they might not be on your same team with respect to the things that you're trying to accomplish. And so you want to know that. Sometimes people are just going to be antagonistic to the things you're trying to bring about. And rather than being blind to that, like, oh, we're all in this together, you want to be aware if someone's actively working against you or is just kind of biased against it, so that you can take that into account and act differently. So this is sort of a simplistic one, but here's another example of a Burja map that's more complicated, probably more realistic as well. That's based off of a chapter in Simon's book called The Scenario. He has this really lovely like exercise in his book that you're supposed to use to make a Wordly map to see if you understand it, and what decisions you would make based off of the information that he gives you. But it's also a good chance to map social structures using this empire theory or Burja Mapping. And so I made a map of that. And this is more realistic because typically organizations have, on the order of like, 15, 20 people or more or something like that. And you'll see in this case, some of these are like teams, a digital team, for example, sales team and so on. And those can be treated as whole entities, or in Samo's language, empires for themselves. So my suggestion is basically if you're working with a hierarchical power structure, either your own organization or someone else's, of course you want to be aware of the official sanctioned org charts, but you also want to have your own mental understanding of the power dynamics in that organization. Again, whether it's your own or someone else's, that there are these different power dynamics and you want to have a solid understanding of that, and making your own kind of map can be helpful for that. This is just the way that I make these maps, but you can make your own drawing. I mean, we saw Tom's drawing back here. This is how he draws them out. It doesn't really matter how you draw them out. You don't even need to draw them out. The idea is you want to have your own understanding of the power dynamics, especially because these are constantly changing, and certainly they're not always reflective of the officially sanctioned power statements about power. A lot of the things that people tend to do when they realize this is make a SWOT diagram. And there's this really lovely chapter in Simon's book where he makes fun of this. He talks about the example of Themistocles in what's now known as King Leonidas and the 300 Spartans. He's making the point that where you choose a battle really matters. And so they had this battle in the Hot Gates where they, like 300 or 4,000 Greeks could fight against, say, 200,000 Persians. And because they picked that location to fight, they had a much higher success than they would have otherwise. And that's because Simon's claiming they had an actual map of the landscape. And so he's like, what if, Themistocles had said, no worries, everyone, I made a SWOT diagram instead of a map. We're gonna be great. These are our strengths, these are our weaknesses. Now let's do battle. It's kind of silly. And this is the view that I'd always had of SWOT diagrams. They never really made sense to me why you would make them. It's like, okay, people have strengths and weaknesses. What are these opportunities? What are these threats? But I would say that in the context of something like your own understanding of the landscape of power, whether it's a Burja map or something else, then given that, assuming you have that as a prerequisite, then a SWOT diagram starts to make a lot of sense because you do have an actually good map of the social reality. So if you juxtapose this sort of thing or this sort of thing or this sort of thing with a SWOT diagram, then it starts to make sense. So this is an example fake SWOT diagram that I made. I actually like to use different terms for the last two because they sort of make more sense to me. I talk about them in terms of objectives and traps. So people have different strengths and weaknesses, and you want to know what their strengths and weaknesses are. But you also want to know what their goals are or their objectives. So this person, Joe, who's in your organization as a fundraiser, he has his own goals. He wants to, in this case, increase his money and get a promotion. He wants to increase his earnings as a fundraiser and make a promotion. So he has his own personal goals that may or may not be related to the goals of the larger organization. You want to know that. And then you have traps. You understand that you yourself also have strengths and weaknesses. And so you have this interpersonal, interrelational traps thing where it's like, okay, given what I know about myself and given what I know about other people, what are the possible traps that we could fall into? What are the things that we could do that would be problematic? So in this case, I was like, well, because he's sort of aloof and impulsive, he might not seek feedback when he needs it, and he might resign if he feels isolated for long periods of time. So that's kind of an extreme example that I just made up. But when we have these relationships with people, there are traps that we can fall into where you have your weaknesses and they have their weaknesses, and those can combine to create friction. And you want to anticipate that rather than just stumbling into it unknowingly. So the point here is, if you have a landscape of power that you've sort of drawn out, that you've mapped out, then it makes more sense to have a SWOT diagram where you kind of take stock of different people's strengths and weaknesses, also their goals, and any traps that you might fall into. And this is actually a similar point that Simon makes. There's something like 18 chapters later in his book, he's like, oh, let's make a SWOT diagram. And he says, SWOT, isn't that the curse of simplistic management? Yes, but it also has its uses, particularly if we understand the landscape, if we have a map, in other words. The problem with SWOT isn't that it's useless, but instead that we apply it to landscapes we don't understand. So in the same way, if we have a map of social reality where we understand the different power dynamics, and that is somewhat accurate, not just giving in to the official org chart, but sort of a more nuanced understanding, then it makes sense to have a SWOT diagram. And you can actually make these not only for individual people, but also teams or organizations as a whole. So like something you really need to be aware of is everyone, both individuals and teams and organizations, they all have strengths and weaknesses. I personally have strengths and weaknesses. You personally have strengths and weaknesses. You know, the monastery has strengths and weaknesses. Maybe Willow and Oak, our California location and Canada locations, maybe they have different strengths and weaknesses. Maybe the Stoa has different strengths and weaknesses. We all have different goals, and we have different traps that we can fall into interrelationally. So you can kind of map this out at any scope of attention that you want. I could make a map just of our California location or of our national organization as a whole. I could make a map of the Stoa. I could make a map of any organization, you know, Google, Facebook, whatever. And you can do that at any scale. And all of those are going to have strengths, weaknesses, objectives or goals, and traps that you could fall into in relation with those different scales. So one of the really nice things about alliances is that you can have very blunt conversations. Whenever I talk to my allies, we just have these very frank conversations that aren't always necessarily like socially sanctioned. If you just have like chat over coffee, and you know, for example, the basic question is, what do you need? So typically my allies will really need something. There's something they're bottlenecked on, and I want to know what that is in case I'm suddenly able to provide that to them. I might not be able to, often I'm not, but if I know about it, then that's the first step to being able to realize that. I want to have this kind of situational awareness of what they're doing, what's going well, what's not going well, what kind of challenges are they facing, what are they learning, and what do they need? And if I know all of those things, then I might be able to help. And similarly, I want other people to know what's going on with me and my goals and what's going on with our organization, and have that situational awareness into what I'm doing, so that if they suddenly have the conditions to help me, then they will help me. You know, so for our organization, this is a diagram that I made of what I think we need. Monasteries have the opportunity to create these trustworthy leaders, these trustworthy communities, culture, economy, and ultimately a trustworthy humanity. But all of that is only possible if we have money, land, and people. And specifically, right now we're doing pretty well on people. We have a lot of interest. We're doing okay on land. We're hoping to move in California to a new location. But the main thing that we seem to be bottlenecked on, both at our individual locations and also as our organization as a whole, is money. And so with my allies, I can just frankly say, look, we're trying to raise this much money for these reasons. Do you know anyone that would help? And maybe they do, and maybe they don't, but at least I can talk to them very frankly about it. And you know, often they're able to connect me with people who might want to give us money, or might want to give us land, or might know someone who wants to join the monastery or something like that. And if I can just speak bluntly about that with them, then it's more likely that it's going to happen. And they can speak similarly bluntly with me. You know, they can say, oh, we're having this problem in our engineering team, and we're switching to this new technology, and I don't really understand it, but we need more people that understand this. And then I might meet someone who knows about that and is actually looking for a job, and I can connect them. And so there's no guarantee that you're going to get what you need, but if having an alliance like this, or even many alliances like this, a strong network of alliances indeed, is the conditions for good consequences to arise for someone. Someone will kind of benefit from having these, this awareness of who your alliances are and what they need and what's happening for them.